Jake Murphy sat in his small cabin aboard the transport ship New Baltimore and stared at the mission file on his tablet screen. The words looked simple enough, but something felt wrong about this job. Colonial Services wanted him to handle a pest problem on Kepler 442c, and they were paying triple the usual rate for what they called a standard extermination task. He had been doing this work for 12 years and had never seen a payout this large for something they described as routine. Jake had killed acid worms on Mars that could melt through steel, and invisible hunters on Europa that could tear a man apart in seconds. The pay for those jobs was nothing compared to this. The file showed pictures of crop damage across 3 farming districts on Kepler 442c. Something had been eating the grain in perfect circles and leaving behind strange marks in the dirt. The local farmers tried everything from electric fences to poison bait, but nothing worked. Then the colonial military sent in 2 squads of soldiers with advanced weapons and tracking gear. Both military teams came back empty-handed after 3 weeks of hunting. The creature they were chasing seemed to know where every trap was placed and how to avoid every camera. It moved through the forest like it could see in complete darkness and hear sounds from miles away. The soldiers said it was unlike anything in their training manuals. Jake scrolled through the witness reports and felt his stomach tighten. Farmer Bill Carter said the thing watched him from the tree line for an hour while he worked his field. It never moved closer, but Carter swore he could feel eyes on him the entire time. Another farmer named Roy Adams claimed the creature followed him home one night and stood outside his house until dawn just looking at the windows. The strangest report came from Dr. Helen Shaw, who studied animals for the Colonial Science Division. She spent 2 weeks trying to track the creature and said its behavior made no sense for any known species. It avoided her traps too easily and seemed to understand how her equipment worked. Shaw wrote that the creature appeared to be studying the humans rather than simply looking for food. Captain Lisa Brooks knocked on Jake's cabin door and entered without waiting for permission. She was a tough woman who had been flying transport ships for 20 years and rarely showed concern about anything. Today she looked worried as she sat down across from Jake and pointed at his tablet. The captain had read the same files and shared Jake's doubts about this mission. She told him that in all her years of carrying pest control specialists to colony worlds, she had never seen military units fail so completely. 2 full squads with the best equipment colonial forces could provide should have been able to handle any animal problem. Jake asked why Colonial Services was sending just 1 man to do what 2 military squads could not accomplish. Captain Brooks shrugged and said the orders came from high up in the command structure with instructions to treat this as a priority assignment. Someone important wanted this creature dead and wanted Jake to be the one who killed it. The ship would reach Kepler 442c in 18 hours, and Jake spent that time studying every detail in the mission files. He looked at the crop damage patterns and noticed something the military analysts had missed. The circles of eaten grain were not random, but followed a specific mathematical sequence. Each circle was exactly 1.618 times larger than the previous one. Jake had seen that number before in his engineering classes. It was called the golden ratio and appeared throughout nature in flower petals and seashell spirals. No animal ate crops in patterns based on advanced mathematics. This meant whatever was destroying the farms was intelligent enough to understand complex numerical relationships. He also noticed that the strange marks left in the dirt were not random scratches. When Jake arranged them in the order they were discovered, they formed a sequence of symbols that looked almost like a primitive writing system. The marks grew more complex over time, as if something was learning how to communicate with symbols. The military reports mentioned that all electronic equipment malfunctioned near the creature, but the failures were selective. Communication devices stopped working, but weapon systems remained functional. Cameras went dark, but motion sensors continued to operate. It was as if the creature understood human technology well enough to disable only the tools that could identify or track it. Jake realized he was not dealing with an animal at all, but with something that could think and plan and learn. The creature was intelligent enough to understand human behavior patterns and advanced enough to manipulate electronic systems. Whatever lived in the forests of Kepler 442c was far more dangerous than any pest he had encountered before. As the New Baltimore approached the colony world, Jake felt a mixture of excitement and fear that reminded him of his first deep space assignment. He had built his reputation by solving problems that other specialists could not handle, but this mission was different. The creature on Kepler 442c had already proven it was smarter than trained soldiers and more adaptable than any animal in the colonial databases. Jake checked his equipment one final time and made sure his weapons were loaded with fresh power cells. He carried a plasma rifle that could punch holes through tank armor and a stun weapon that could drop a charging bull elephant. His suit had built-in life support systems and armor plating that could stop most projectile weapons, but as Jake looked out the porthole at the blue and green planet growing larger in the view screen, he wondered if his weapons and armor would be enough. The report suggested this creature was unlike anything humans had encountered before, and Jake was walking into a situation where two military squads had already failed. Captain Brooks announced over the ship intercom that they would be landing at New Darwin Colony in 30 minutes. Jake gathered his gear and prepared for what might be the most challenging assignment of his career. Colonial Services was paying him enough money to retire comfortably, but first he had to survive long enough to earn it. The New Baltimore touched down on the landing pad outside New Darwin Colony as the local sun was setting behind the mountains. Jake could see the agricultural fields stretching away toward the dark forest where something intelligent was waiting for him. He shouldered his equipment pack and walked toward the airlock, knowing that his life was about to change in ways he could not imagine. Jake Murphy walked through the main street of New Darwin Colony and noticed how quiet everything seemed. The few colonists he passed moved quickly and kept glancing toward the forest that surrounded their small town. Children stayed close to their parents, and no one lingered outside after the sun began to set behind the mountains. Administrator Carol Price met Jake at the Colonial Headquarters building and led him to her office. She was a thin woman in her 50s who looked like she had not slept well in weeks. Dark circles under her eyes and shaking hands told Jake that the creature problem was worse than the official reports indicated. Price spread maps across her desk and showed Jake where the attacks had happened over the past 2 months. The pattern was expanding outward from the deep forest toward the inhabited areas of the colony. What started as minor crop damage in distant fields had moved closer to homes and businesses with each passing week. She told Jake that the creature had become bolder in recent days, and several farmers reported seeing it during daylight hours. The thing no longer hid in the forest but stood at the edges of fields and watched people work. Some colonists claimed it was studying their daily routines and learning how the colony operated. Jake asked about the military units that had tried to hunt the creature. Price explained that the soldiers spent 3 weeks setting traps and following tracks but never got close to their target. Every morning they would find their equipment disabled or moved to different locations. Motion sensors were carefully dismantled and cameras were turned to face the ground. The strangest incident happened during the final week of the military operation. Sergeant Danny Ross was on patrol near the forest when his communication device started picking up signals that sounded like someone trying to speak. The voice was distorted but seemed to be attempting human words. Ross called for backup, but by the time other soldiers arrived, the signals had stopped that night. Jake set up his surveillance equipment in a field where the creature had been seen most recently. He placed motion detectors in a wide circle around his position and activated thermal cameras that could see heat signatures through complete darkness. His plasma rifle lay across his knees, ready for immediate use. Jake had hunted dangerous creatures on dozens of worlds and knew how to remain perfectly still for hours at a time. He controlled his breathing and kept his heart rate steady while scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest remained quiet except for normal sounds of wind and small animals. Around midnight, Jake's motion sensors began to malfunction one by one. The devices did not break or show signs of damage, but simply stopped sending signals to his control unit. Someone or something was moving through his detection grid and systematically disabling each sensor with surgical precision. Jake switched to manual observation and used his thermal scope to scan the forest edge. He saw nothing unusual until a shape moved between two large trees about 50 meters away. The figure was tall and thin with long arms that seemed too flexible for human joints. It moved with fluid grace that reminded Jake of dancers he had seen performing in Earth cities. The creature stepped into the open field, and Jake got his first clear look at what the colonists had been describing. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, on two legs, but its proportions were wrong for any animal he knew. The arms reached almost to the ground, and the head was larger than human size with features hidden in shadow. Jake raised his thermal scope and was surprised to see that the creature showed no heat signature at all. It appeared as a cold outline against the warm background of the field. Either its body temperature was the same as the surrounding air, or it had some way of masking thermal radiation. As Jake watched through his scope, the creature began to move its arms in deliberate patterns. It was not walking or searching for food, but making gestures that looked almost like sign language. The movements were too complex and purposeful to be random animal behavior. Jake lowered his weapon and observed the creature without making any threatening moves. Something in its body language suggested intelligence rather than aggression. It was not stalking him like a predator, but seemed to be trying to communicate in some way. The creature noticed Jake's position and turned to face him directly. Even though Jake could not see its features clearly, he felt certain it was looking right at him through the darkness. Instead of attacking or running away, the creature began to make different gestures with its elongated arms. Jake realized the creature was not trying to hurt him, but was attempting some form of communication. He had encountered intelligent species before on other colony worlds and recognized the careful way the creature moved to avoid appearing threatening. It kept its distance and made no sudden movements that might startle Jake into firing his weapon. After several minutes of watching each other across the dark field, the creature did something that surprised Jake completely. It began to scratch marks in the dirt using one of its long, thin fingers. Even from 50 meters away, Jake could see that the marks followed straight lines and geometric patterns. Jake set down his rifle and pulled out a small flashlight. He pointed the beam at the ground near his feet and began to scratch his own marks in the soil. He drew simple geometric shapes, including circles and triangles, to see how the creature would respond. The creature immediately became more animated when it saw Jake's light and drawings. It made a sound that was almost like human laughter before creating much more complex patterns in the dirt. Jake could see mathematical relationships in the marks, including sequences of numbers and geometric proofs. Jake drew the numbers 1 through 10 in the dirt using simple lines and dots. The creature watched his work intently and then created its own number sequence. But instead of counting to 10, it continued all the way to 20 and then began drawing what looked like mathematical equations. Jake felt his hands shake as he realized what was happening. The creature was not only intelligent but understood advanced mathematics and was trying to teach him its number system. This was first contact with an alien intelligence, and it was happening in a farm field on a colony world that most humans had never heard of. He put away his weapon and moved slowly toward the creature with his hands raised to show he carried nothing dangerous. The creature responded by taking several steps in Jake's direction until they stood only 20 feet apart. Up close, Jake could see that its skin seemed to shift and change color like a chameleon adapting to its surroundings. The creature pointed to itself and made a sound that Jake thought might be its name or species designation. Then it pointed to Jake and waited as if expecting him to respond. Jake said his name clearly, and the creature repeated the sounds with surprising accuracy, considering its mouth structure was probably very different from human anatomy. For the next hour, Jake and the creature exchanged basic information using drawings, mathematics, and simple sounds. Jake learned that there were others like this creature living in the forest and that they had been watching the human colony since it was established. 5 years ago, the most important thing Jake discovered was that the crop damage was not random vandalism or feeding behavior. The creature and its people were trying to create messages large enough to be seen from space. They had been attempting to communicate with the human spacecraft that brought colonists to their world as dawn approached. The creature gathered up the mathematical drawings it had made and carefully erased them from the dirt. It pointed toward the forest and made sounds that Jake interpreted as an invitation to follow. Then it turned and walked back toward the trees, moving with the same fluid grace Jake had observed earlier. Jake stood alone in the field as the sun rose over the mountains and realized his life had just changed forever. He was no longer a pest control specialist sent to kill a dangerous animal. He was humanity's first ambassador to an alien civilization that had been trying to make peaceful contact for years. Jake Murphy followed the creature through dense forest paths that seemed invisible until they were right in front of him. The being he had started thinking of as the teacher moved through the wilderness with perfect knowledge of every tree root and hanging branch. Jake stumbled often, but his guide waited patiently. Each time he fell behind. After walking for 2 hours, they reached a valley hidden between steep mountain walls. Jake stopped at the edge of a cliff and looked down at something that should not have existed on any colony world. Below him spread a settlement of elegant buildings that seemed to grow from the living rock. Like organic sculptures, the teacher made soft sounds and gestured toward a narrow path that wound down the cliff face. Jake followed carefully and noticed that the path had been carved with tools more precise than anything humans brought to Kepler 442c. Every step was exactly the right height and depth for comfortable walking. As they descended into the valley, Jake saw more of the tall beings moving between the strange buildings. They all had the same elongated proportions as the teacher, but their skin colors varied from deep brown to pale silver. Some tended gardens filled with plants that glowed softly in the morning light. The teacher led Jake to a large structure at the center of the settlement and made welcoming gestures toward an opening in the wall. Inside, Jake found himself in a vast room with walls covered in symbols and mathematical equations. The ceiling curved overhead like the inside of a shell and seemed to emit gentle light without any visible source. An older member of the species approached Jake, and he could see immediately that this was someone of great importance. The being's skin was marked with intricate patterns, and its eyes held the wisdom of many years. The teacher made formal sounds and gestures that Jake interpreted as introductions. The elder being pointed to itself and spoke a word that sounded like Kes. Then it pointed to Jake and repeated his name with the same accuracy the teacher had shown. Kes moved to the wall and began touching symbols in sequence while making sounds that gradually began to resemble human speech. Jake realized that Kes was using some kind of translation system built into the wall symbols. After several minutes of adjustment, Kes spoke in words Jake could understand, though the voice sounded artificial like a computer translation program. Kes explained that Jake's people were called the Observers, and they had lived in this valley for thousands of years before humans arrived on Kepler 442c. They were not native to this world but had come here as refugees from a great disaster that destroyed their original home among the stars. The Observers possessed technology that allowed them to manipulate electromagnetic fields and bend light around their bodies for camouflage. They could interface directly with electronic systems using implants grown into their nervous systems during childhood. Their understanding of mathematics and physics was far beyond human knowledge. Kes showed Jake displays on the wall that revealed the true scope of Observer civilization. They maintained hidden settlements on dozens of worlds throughout this region of the galaxy. Their people served as watchers and recorders, documenting the rise and fall of younger species that achieved space travel. Jake learned that the Observers had been studying human expansion across the galaxy for over a century. They maintained detailed records of human behavior patterns, cultural development, and technological progress. The settlement on Kepler 442c was one of many observation posts, monitoring human colonial activities. The most shocking revelation came when Kes activated a display showing the histories of 17 different intelligent species that had achieved interstellar travel over the past million years. 13 of those civilizations had eventually destroyed themselves through warfare, environmental collapse, or technological disasters. 3 other species had simply vanished from the galaxy without explanation, leaving behind only empty worlds and mysterious ruins. The Observers had documented each civilization's final years and recorded the mistakes that led to their Extinction. Only one species besides humans had shown the combination of curiosity, adaptability, and wisdom that the observers considered necessary for long-term survival. That species had transcended physical existence millions of years ago and now existed as beings of pure energy who helped guide younger civilizations. Guests explained that Jake's mission to Kepler 442c was not coincidental. The observers had been subtly influencing galactic communication networks to ensure their pest problem would attract someone like Jake rather than a military extermination team. They needed to test human responses to contact with unknown intelligence. Jake was actually the third human to make contact with observers on different worlds. The first human had immediately reported back to military authorities, leading to a violent confrontation that ended with several observer deaths. The second human had tried to capture an observer for scientific study. Both previous contacts convinced the observers that humans might follow the same destructive path as the 13 failed civilizations in their records. But Jake's patient approach and willingness to communicate represented something different that gave the observers hope for human potential. Cass activated another wall display that showed Jake the true extent of observer surveillance across human space. They had monitoring stations near every major human colony and detailed intelligence about human military capabilities, political structures, and social development patterns. The observers were facing a crucial decision about humanity's future. They could reveal themselves and offer humans access to advanced technology and membership in a galactic community of surviving species. Or they could remain hidden and allow humans to develop naturally without interference. Jake realized that his actions over the next few days would influence the observer decision about human worthiness. He was being tested not just as an individual but as a representative of his entire species. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing as he understood what was at stake. If humans passed the observer evaluation, they would gain access to knowledge and technology that could solve most of Earth's problems and ensure human survival for millions of years. If humans failed the test, the observers would disappear forever and humanity would remain alone in a galaxy where most intelligent species eventually destroyed themselves. Kes showed Jake a communication device that would allow him to contact the observers from anywhere on the planet. The device also provided access to some observer technology, including translation systems and basic scientific instruments. But Kes warned that the real test was not technological but moral. Jake had to find a way to resolve the pest problem that satisfied his human employers while protecting the observer community from discovery or harm. He needed to demonstrate that humans could balance their own interests with the greater good of galactic civilization. As Jake prepared to leave the hidden valley, he felt the weight of representing all humanity in this first contact situation. The decision he made in the coming days could determine whether humans eventually joined a community of galactic civilizations or remained isolated until they followed the path of extinction that had claimed 13 other intelligent species. Kes walked with Jake to the edge of the valley and spoke final words of encouragement and warning. The observers would be watching his every action and decision. If he succeeded in protecting their secret while solving the human problem, they would consider formal contact with human leaders. If Jake failed or betrayed their trust, the observers would use their advanced technology to disappear completely. They would relocate to distant worlds and ensure that humans never found evidence of their existence. Humanity would lose its only chance to learn that they were not alone in the universe. Jake climbed back up the cliff path carrying the observer communication device and the knowledge that the next few days would determine the future of human civilization. Behind him, the hidden valley faded into invisibility as observer technology concealed it from any possible detection. Jake Murphy sat in his temporary quarters at New Darwin Colony and stared at the observer communication device while trying to process everything he had learned. The small crystalline object hummed softly and displayed symbols that his mind somehow understood thanks to observer translation technology. The weight of representing all humanity felt heavier with each passing. Our administrator, Carol Price, knocked on his door at dawn and entered with a cup of coffee and a worried expression. She asked about his progress with the pest problem and mentioned that Colonial Services headquarters was demanding daily reports. The pressure from above was increasing and Price needed results soon. Jake told her he was making progress, but required more time to understand the creature's behavior patterns. He requested access to the Colonial Biology Laboratory and permission to set up long-term monitoring equipment in the affected areas. Price agreed but warned him that headquarters would not wait much longer for a solution in the biology lab. Jake met Dr. Amy Foster, who specialized in xenobiology and had been studying the crop damage patterns. She was a young woman with keen intelligence and genuine curiosity about alien life forms. Jake realized she could be either a valuable ally or a dangerous complication, depending on how much he revealed. Dr. Foster showed Jake detailed analysis of the soil samples from damaged fields and pointed out chemical traces that did not match any known animal proteins. She suspected the creature was not native to Kepler 442c but had come from somewhere else. Her conclusions were getting dangerously close to the truth. Jake used the Observer communication device to contact Kess and explained his situation. He needed a way to satisfy Colonial Services while protecting the Observer community from discovery. The response came quickly with detailed plans that demonstrated how thoroughly the Observers understood human bureaucratic systems. Kess explained that the Observers had been preparing for this moment for decades. They had studied human first contact protocols and colonial administration procedures. They knew exactly what kind of evidence and documentation would be required to change the mission from extermination to diplomatic contact. The Observer plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jake would report the discovery of an indigenous intelligent species that had evolved on Kepler 442c long before human arrival. The crop damage would be reframed as primitive attempts at communication from beings who were trying to establish peaceful contact with the human colonists. Jake would need to provide scientific evidence supporting this conclusion, including video documentation, genetic samples, and behavioral analysis. The Observers were prepared to supply all the necessary proof while carefully hiding their true technological capabilities and galactic origins. Dr. Foster became Jake's unwitting partner in creating the false scientific record. She was eager to be part of discovering the first intelligent alien species and threw herself into documenting what she believed was a groundbreaking first contact situation. Her enthusiasm made the deception easier but also more painful for Jake. Observers demonstrated remarkable acting ability as they allowed themselves to be filmed while hiding their advanced technology. They appeared as primitive tool users who had developed basic mathematics and communication skills through natural evolution. The performance was convincing enough to fool xenobiology experts. Jake submitted his initial report to Colonial Services describing the discovery of indigenous intelligence and recommending immediate activation of first contact protocols. The response was swift and dramatic. Within hours, a team of specialists was dispatched from Earth to handle what headquarters now classified as a diplomatic situation rather than a pest problem. The arrival of the first contact team brought both relief and new complications. Dr. Patricia Williams led a group of xenanthropologists and diplomatic specialists who were trained in peaceful interaction with alien civilizations. Their presence removed the pressure for immediate extermination, but created new risks of discovery. Dr. Williams interviewed Jake extensively about his interactions with the indigenous species. Her questions were probing and intelligent, and Jake had to be extremely careful not to reveal details that would expose the Observer deception. The communication device helped him access Observer knowledge about how primitive societies actually developed. Meanwhile, Jake continued his secret meetings with Kess and other Observer leaders. They were pleased with his progress but warned that the most difficult part of the test was still ahead. The real challenge would be maintaining the deception while establishing sustainable coexistence between humans and the supposedly primitive Observers. Kess revealed that this type of staged first contact had been attempted twice before with other human groups. Both previous attempts had failed when the humans involved became too curious about Observer technology or too suspicious about the convenient timing of the contact situation. The Observer test was designed to measure several aspects of human character: Could humans show respect for beings they considered less technologically advanced? Would they honor agreements made with species they could easily dominate? Most importantly, could they resist the temptation to exploit or study their new neighbors too aggressively? Jake watched the human specialists interact with the disguised observers and felt proud of how well his people were handling the situation. The xenanthropologists showed genuine respect and curiosity without trying to capture or coerce the aliens. The diplomatic team worked carefully to establish communication protocols that respected observer autonomy, but Jake also noticed troubling signs that made him understand why previous tests had failed. Some team members spoke privately about the scientific value of studying primitive alien development. Others discussed the potential resources that could be extracted from observer territory in exchange for advanced technology. Dr. Foster approached Jake with concerns about inconsistencies in the observer behavior that suggested they might be more advanced than they appeared. Her scientific training made her suspicious of certain details that did not fit the primitive development model. Jake had to carefully redirect her attention without arousing further suspicion. The most dangerous moment came when observer youth began showing too much curiosity about human technology. Several young observers had to be quietly disciplined by their elders after they demonstrated knowledge that supposedly primitive beings should not possess. Jake realized how difficult it was to maintain such an elaborate deception. Kess contacted Jake through the communication device with news that observer leadership was debating whether to continue the test or abort the entire operation. Some elder observers believed the risk of discovery was becoming too great. Others argued that Jake's performance justified giving humanity more time to prove itself worthy. The debate was settled when Colonial Services headquarters sent orders to establish a permanent research station in observer territory. The human government wanted to study the newly discovered species and monitor their development over many years. This level of scrutiny would make maintaining the deception impossible. Jake faced his greatest challenge as he realized he had to find a way to protect the observer's secret while satisfying human scientific curiosity and bureaucratic requirements. The test had evolved beyond simple first contact into a complex game of managing competing interests and hidden agendas. Kess informed Jake that observer leadership had reached a decision. They would give him one final opportunity to prove human worthiness by resolving the research station problem. If he succeeded, the observers would reveal their true nature to selected human leaders and begin genuine first contact procedures. If Jake failed to prevent excessive human interference in observer affairs, the test would end with complete observer withdrawal from Kepler 442c. They would relocate their entire community to distant worlds and ensure that humans never found evidence of their existence anywhere in the galaxy. The stakes could not be higher as Jake prepared for what might be his final chance to secure humanity's place in galactic civilization. Everything depended on his ability to balance human expectations with observer security requirements while maintaining a deception that was becoming more fragile with each passing day. Jake Murphy spent 3 sleepless nights working with observer leaders to develop a solution that would satisfy human bureaucratic requirements while protecting the observer community from excessive scrutiny. The plan they created was ambitious and risky, but represented the only path forward that might preserve both species' interests. The key insight came from Dr. Amy Foster, who had been analyzing observer territory and discovered rare mineral deposits that were extremely valuable to human industry. Jake realized this geological treasure could be used to redirect human attention away from the observers themselves toward resource extraction and mining opportunities. Jake contacted Administrator Carol Price with a revised report that emphasized the economic potential of observer lands while downplaying the scientific value of studying the indigenous species. He explained that the observers were willing to negotiate mining rights in exchange for protected status for their sacred sites and hunting grounds. Colonial Services headquarters responded exactly as the observers had predicted. The promise of valuable mineral extraction shifted bureaucratic priorities from scientific research to commercial development. Instead of xenanthropologists and research stations, The colony would receive mining engineers and extraction. EQUIPMENTDR Patricia Williams protested the change in mission focus but was overruled by economic planners, who saw greater benefit in mineral wealth than in studying primitive aliens. Jake felt guilty about manipulating human greed, but understood that this was the only way to reduce the level of observation that would threaten observer security. The observers demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of human psychology by providing Jake with mining survey data that was accurate enough to prove valuable but incomplete enough to require years of additional exploration. This would keep human attention focused underground rather than on observer behavior patterns. Jake worked with Dr. Foster to establish a wildlife preserve that would protect observer living areas under the guise of environmental conservation. The preserve boundaries were carefully drawn to include all observer settlements while appearing to follow natural ecosystem boundaries rather than alien territorial requirements. The most delicate part of the plan involved training young observers to maintain their primitive technology disguised during inevitable future contact with human miners and colonists. Kess established strict protocols requiring all observers to hide their advanced capabilities and communicate only through carefully rehearsed behavioral patterns. Jake submitted his final report recommending a mixed development approach that combined limited mining operations with indigenous species protection and long-term ecological monitoring. Colonial Services approved the plan and reassigned most of the first contact specialists to other projects where their expertise was needed more urgently. Dr. Foster remained as the primary scientific liaison between humans and observers, but her role was now focused on environmental protection rather than detailed species analysis. Jake helped her develop monitoring protocols that would document observer welfare without requiring invasive study of their social structures or technological capabilities. The transition to the new arrangement took several months, during which Jake lived with constant anxiety about potential discovery. Every interaction between humans and observers carried the risk of exposing details that did not fit the primitive development narrative. Several close calls required quick thinking and careful misdirection. The most dangerous incident occurred when a young observer named Zeph forgot the behavioral restrictions and demonstrated advanced mathematical knowledge to a human mining surveyor. Jake had to quickly improvise an explanation about observers having natural pattern recognition abilities that made them appear more intelligent than they actually were. As privately disciplined Zeph and implemented additional training programs to prevent similar mistakes. Jake realized how difficult it was for an advanced civilization to pretend to be primitive, especially when their natural curiosity made them want to learn about human technology and culture. Despite the challenges, the new arrangement began to work. As human attention shifted toward mineral extraction and away from intensive observer study, the mining operations provided economic benefits that satisfied Colonial Services while the wildlife preserve protected observer territory from unwanted intrusion. Jake established himself as the primary human expert on observer behavior and used this position to control the flow of information about the species. He authored scientific papers that portrayed observers as fascinating but ultimately limited beings who were best studied through minimal interference approaches. Dr. Foster became Jake's ally in promoting hands-off conservation policies that protected observers from excessive human contact. She genuinely believed she was preserving a unique alien species, while unknowingly helping to maintain one of the most complex deceptions in human history. 6 months after implementing the new arrangement, Jake received a message through the observer communication device requesting a private meeting with Kess and other Elder Council members. The meeting location was a remote cave system that provided complete security from human surveillance. Kess informed Jake that observer leadership was pleased with his performance but wanted to test one final aspect of human character before making their ultimate decision about formal contact. The test involved Jake's personal integrity and his ability to handle the psychological burden of maintaining the deception. The observers revealed that they had been monitoring Jake's emotional state and had detected signs of stress and guilt related to deceiving his fellow humans. They understood that lying to people he cared about was causing Jake's significant psychological pain, and they wanted to see if he could maintain the necessary deception. Despite personal costs, Jake admitted that keeping the Observer secret was becoming increasingly difficult, especially in his interactions with Dr. Foster, who trusted him completely and believed they were working together to protect a primitive alien species. He felt guilty about manipulating her scientific enthusiasm for personal gain. Kess explained that this internal conflict was exactly what Observer leadership needed to evaluate. Many intelligent species developed impressive technologies and complex societies, but few produced individuals capable of sacrificing personal comfort for the greater good of interspecies relations. The final test required Jake to maintain the deception for one additional year while Colonial Services established permanent mining and conservation operations on Kepler 442c. If he could successfully protect the Observer's secret during this extended period, the observers would consider him worthy of learning about their true galactic civilization. Jake agreed to continue the deception despite the personal costs because he understood what was at stake for humanity. The opportunity to join a galactic community of intelligent species was worth any amount of personal discomfort or guilt about necessary lies. Over the following months, Jake watched as human mining operations began extracting valuable minerals from Observer territory while carefully avoiding the protected areas where the aliens actually lived. The arrangement satisfied both species' immediate needs while laying the groundwork for potential future cooperation. Dr. Foster published research papers about Observer ecology and behavior that established her reputation as a leading expert on the species. Jake helped her develop theories about Observer intelligence that were accurate enough to be scientifically valuable but incomplete enough to hide the truth about their advanced capabilities. The year passed slowly as Jake maintained his double life as both human colonial representative and secret alien ambassador. The psychological strain was enormous, but he drew strength from knowing that his actions might determine whether humanity remained alone in the universe or joined a community of galactic civilizations. As the deadline approached, Jake felt cautiously optimistic that he had successfully passed the Observer test. Human operations on Kepler 442c were proceeding smoothly, and the Observer community remained hidden and secure. Both species seemed to be adapting well to their carefully managed coexistence arrangement. Jake Murphy stood in the observation deck of Luna Station and watched Earth slowly rotate beneath him while waiting for his meeting with Colonial Services Director General Patricia Webb. The encrypted message that brought him here had been brief but urgent. After 80 months on Kepler 442c, Jake was finally being recalled to headquarters for reasons no one would explain. The Director General's office occupied an entire section of the station's command deck with windows that provided spectacular views of Earth and the surrounding space traffic. Jake had never met Webb personally, but her reputation as a tough administrator who had guided human colonial expansion for over a decade was well known. Webb was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around her with military precision. She gestured for Jake to sit across from her desk and activated privacy screens that would prevent any electronic surveillance of their conversation. The level of security suggested this meeting involved classified information. Webb opened a thick folder marked with security classifications Jake had never seen before and spread several photographs across her desk. Jake's heart stopped when he recognized images of Observer settlements taken from orbit by advanced surveillance satellites. The pictures showed details that should have been invisible to human technology. The Director General explained that Colonial Services had been monitoring Observer activities on Kepler 442c since before Jake's arrival. High-resolution satellite imagery had detected heat signatures and electromagnetic anomalies that indicated the presence of advanced technology in areas supposedly inhabited by primitive aliens. Jake tried to maintain his composure while preparing explanations for the evidence Webb was showing him. But before he could speak, Webb activated a holographic display that showed him something impossible. The projection displayed a detailed map of Observer settlements across 17 different star systems, including worlds where humans had never established colonies. Webb told Jake that Colonial Services had been in limited contact with observer representatives for over 12 years. A secret diplomatic corps maintained by the highest levels of human government had been conducting careful negotiations with what they initially believed was a single advanced alien civilization. The truth was far more complex than Jake had imagined. The observers were not just one species, but representatives of a galactic network that monitored and guided emerging civilizations across hundreds of worlds. They served as scouts and evaluators for even more advanced beings who existed beyond normal space and time. Jake learned that his mission to Kepler 442c had been planned jointly by Human Intelligence Services and Observer leadership. Both sides wanted to test whether ordinary humans could handle first contact situations with wisdom and restraint rather than fear, and Aggression Webb explained that Jake was not the first human to be tested by the observers, but he was the first to pass their comprehensive evaluation. Previous test subjects had either reported the aliens to military authorities or attempted to capture them for scientific study. Jake's patient diplomatic approach represented something unprecedented in Observer records, the revelation that stunned Jake most was learning that humanity was only the second species in galactic history to successfully pass the Observer evaluation process. The other successful species had achieved technological transcendence millions of years ago and now existed as energy beings who helped guide younger civilizations toward maturity. Webb activated another display that showed Jake the broader context of his actions on Kepler 442c. The Observer Network maintained surveillance on 43 emerging civilizations that had achieved interstellar travel. Most of these species eventually destroyed themselves through warfare, environmental collapse, or technological disasters. Human civilization was being offered membership in the Galactic Observation Network, a secret organization that monitored and guided emerging species while maintaining the appearance of natural development. Humans would serve as observers and first contact specialists for newer civilizations, while learning from beings far more advanced than themselves. The offer came with enormous responsibilities and equally enormous opportunities. Humans would gain access to technologies that could solve Earth's environmental problems and ensure human survival for millions of years. In exchange, they would help determine which young civilizations deserved guidance and which might follow the path of self-destruction. Webb told Jake that he was being offered the position of humanity's first galactic observer. His mission would be to travel to worlds where young civilizations were beginning to explore space and evaluate their potential for joining the galactic community. He would become for other species what Kess had been for humanity. Jake felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was being asked to accept. The role would require him to leave behind everything familiar and spend years living among alien civilizations that had no idea they were being evaluated. The psychological challenges would be enormous, but the potential benefits for all intelligent life were immeasurable. Webb gave Jake access to classified files that documented the true extent of galactic civilization. Hundreds of species had achieved space travel over the past million years, but only a few dozen had developed the wisdom and restraint necessary for long-term survival. The galaxy was far more populated and organized than humans had ever suspected. The most advanced civilizations existed in states beyond physical matter and devoted their energies to nurturing younger species toward enlightenment. They rarely intervened directly but worked through organizations like the Observer Network to identify promising civilizations and guide their development. Jake learned that Earth itself had been under observer surveillance for over 2 centuries. Human technological development and social evolution had been carefully monitored to determine whether the species showed potential for galactic citizenship. The test on Kepler 442c was the final evaluation before formal contact. Webb explained that Jake's success had earned humanity an invitation to join the galactic community, but the transition would be gradual and carefully managed. Only selected humans would initially learn about the broader universe, while the general population continued to believe they were alone among the stars. Jake would be among the first humans to work directly with advanced alien civilizations, and his reports would help determine how quickly humanity could be integrated into galactic society. His role as a field observer would provide valuable experience for both himself and the species he evaluated. The decision Jake faced was perhaps the most important choice any human had ever been asked to make. He could accept the position and become humanity's ambassador to civilizations beyond imagination, or he could decline and return to his old life knowing that he had glimpsed wonders that would remain forever beyond. Human Reachweb gave Jake 24 hours to consider the offer and make his decision. She provided him with quarters on Luna, station and access to additional classified information that would help him understand what he was being asked to undertake. The weight of representing all humanity felt even heavier than it had. On Kepler-442c, Jake spent hours staring out at the stars and thinking about the young civilizations that were taking their first steps into space on distant worlds. Some of those species would develop the wisdom to join the galactic community, while others would follow the path of destruction that had claimed so many before them. By morning, Jake had made his choice. He contacted Webb and accepted the position of humanity's first galactic observer. Within days, he was aboard a ship that seamlessly blended human and observer technology, heading toward a distant system where a species called the Reef Builders had recently achieved faster than light travel. As Jake watched the stars stream past his viewport, he realized that his routine pest control assignment had become humanity's graduation from a galactic kindergarten they never knew they were attending. The universe was far stranger and more wonderful than humans had imagined, and now they had the opportunity to help guide other young species toward the same realization. The ship's destination was a water world where the Reef Builders were beginning to explore their solar system and asking the same questions about alien life that humans had pondered for centuries. Like humanity, before them, they had no idea they were about to be tested by beings who would determine their worthiness to join the greatest community in the galaxy.